Willow Richardson stood in line with the other Marine bootcamp recruits, enduring the drill sergeant's cruel jokes about the skinny little girl who thinks she can be a Marine. For 3 weeks, they'd called her Toothpick and made her clean toilets while telling everyone she'd wash out before graduation. What they didn't know was that Willow Richardson wasn't actually a recruit. She was Colonel Rebecca Stone, the youngest female officer in Marine Corps history, conducting an undercover investigation into training abuse. And when General Marcus Hayes arrived for his surprise inspection and recognized her, the entire boot camp was about to learn that sometimes the person being humiliated outranks everyone in the room. Have you ever witnessed someone endure abuse while knowing they had the power to stop it, but chose to gather evidence instead? Sometimes the strongest people are those who sacrifice their dignity temporarily to protect others permanently. Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island had been training Marines for over a century, transforming civilians into warriors through a rigorous 13-week program that tested physical limits, mental resilience, and character under extreme pressure. The depot's reputation for excellence was built on demanding standards that eliminated those who couldn't meet the challenges of military service while developing those who could into elite fighting forces. But in recent months, disturbing reports had reached the highest levels of Marine Corps command. Anonymous complaints described training methods that crossed the line from challenging instruction into systematic abuse, particularly targeting female recruits. Reports detailed verbal harassment that went far beyond acceptable military discipline, physical punishments that served no training purpose, and psychological manipulation designed to break down rather than build up Marine recruits. Traditional military investigations had failed to uncover evidence of misconduct. Drill sergeants maintained professional facades during official inspections, and recruits were too intimidated to provide honest testimony about training conditions. The chain of command had been unable to determine whether the complaints represented isolated incidents or systemic problems that required immediate intervention. That's when Marine Corps headquarters made an unprecedented decision. They would conduct an undercover investigation using an officer qualified to recognize the difference between legitimate military training and abusive conduct. Colonel Rebecca Stone was the obvious choice for this dangerous and delicate mission. At 28 years old, Rebecca was the youngest female officer ever to achieve the rank of colonel in Marine Corps history. Her military record included combat deployments in 3 different theaters, advanced degrees in military psychology and leadership, and specialized training in undercover operations that had prepared her for assignments requiring assumed identities. More importantly, Rebecca had personal experience with the challenges faced by women in military training. She'd graduated from the same Marine Recruit Depot 15 years earlier, experiencing firsthand the difference between demanding instruction that built character and abusive treatment that served no legitimate training purpose. Her mission was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. Assume the identity of an 18-year-old civilian recruit, document any training violations she witnessed, and gather evidence that could support disciplinary action against personnel who were abusing their authority. The cover identity had been meticulously constructed by military intelligence specialists. Willow Richardson was born in small-town Nebraska, graduated from high school with average grades, and enlisted in the Marines to find direction in her life and serve her country. Her background included no military connections, no advanced education, and no special qualifications that would distinguish her from thousands of other young women who enlisted each year. The physical transformation had been equally careful. Rebecca's military bearing was replaced with the uncertain posture of someone unfamiliar with military culture. Her confident command presence was disguised as nervous enthusiasm. Even her physical fitness was deliberately reduced to levels consistent with civilian recruitment standards, rather than the exceptional conditioning expected of a field-grade officer. For 3 weeks, Colonel Rebecca Stone had disappeared entirely, replaced by Willow Richardson, a recruit who seemed to embody every stereotype that critics used to argue against women in military service. From the moment she'd stepped off the bus at Paris Island, Willow had been marked as a target by drill sergeants who saw her as proof that lowered standards were allowing unqualified women into Marine training. Drill Sergeant Thompson, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for breaking difficult recruits, had taken one look at Willow's slight build and nervous demeanor and declared her the perfect example of why women didn't belong in his Marines. "Look at this one," Thompson had announced loudly enough for the entire recruit company to hear. 5'4" and maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. I've seen scarecrows with more military bearing. The nickname Toothpick had stuck from that first day, and Thompson used every opportunity to reinforce his assessment that Willow was fundamentally unsuited for military service. During physical training, Thompson would make Willow perform extra exercises while commenting on her pathetic performance. During drill instruction, he'd use her as an example of improper technique, even when her movements were correct. During inspections, he'd find faults with her equipment and living space that didn't exist for other recruits. But the psychological harassment was more systematic and damaging than the physical challenges. "Richardson," Thompson would announce during company formations, "tell everyone why you think you deserve to be a Marine when you can barely carry your own equipment." Forced to respond while standing at attention in front of 60 other recruits, Willow would have to endure Thompson's follow-up commentary about how her answers proved that women were too emotional and unprepared for military service. Drill Sergeant Martinez had developed an even more insidious approach to undermining female recruits. He would assign Willow to cleaning duties that other recruits weren't required to perform, explaining that women are naturally better at domestic work and that she should stick to what she knows. When Willow completed these assignments without complaint, Martinez would use her compliance as evidence that she was more suited to support roles than combat training. "See how Richardson enjoys cleaning toilets?" Martinez would tell male recruits. "That's what happens when you let women into Marine training. They turn it into housework." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had perfected the art of public humiliation disguised as training feedback. During weapons instruction, he'd place Willow in positions where she couldn't succeed, then criticize her failures as evidence of female incompetence. "Richardson can't handle the recoil from an M16, Rodriguez would announce after forcing her to fire from unstable positions that would challenge experienced marksmen. "Women just don't have the upper body strength for real military weapons." The systematic nature of the harassment had become clear to Rebecca within the first week. This wasn't random hazing or the kind of demanding instruction that traditionally characterized Marine training. It was deliberate psychological manipulation designed to break down female recruits specifically because of their gender. Male recruits faced demanding training, verbal correction, and physical challenges that pushed them to excel. Female recruits faced additional layers of harassment that served no training purpose and were designed to reinforce stereotypes about women's unsuitability for military service. Rebecca documented every incident with the trained observation skills of someone who'd spent years investigating military misconduct. She memorized conversations, noted patterns of behavior, and identified violations of regulations that explicitly prohibited discrimination based on gender. But perhaps most importantly, she observed how the systematic harassment affected other female recruits who didn't have her training and experience. Private First Class Maria Santos, a 19-year-old from Texas who'd enlisted to follow her father's military tradition, had begun showing signs of severe psychological stress after 2 weeks of treatment similar to what Willow endured. Santos had started questioning her own capabilities and expressing doubts about whether women belonged in military service. Private Jennifer Chen, who'd graduated valedictorian from her high school and scored exceptionally high on military aptitude tests, was beginning to fail exercises she'd previously mastered. The constant criticism and gender-based harassment had undermined her confidence to the point where she was making mistakes that reinforced negative stereotypes about female performance. Most troubling, Rebecca observed that male recruits were learning to accept and participate in the harassment of female Marines. What started as drill sergeant behavior was being adopted by recruits who began treating gender-based discrimination as normal military culture. The investigation had revealed systematic violations of military regulations, deliberate psychological abuse, and training methods that were producing Marines who viewed women as inherently inferior rather than as equal members of military teams. But Rebecca's cover identity meant she had to endure the abuse without revealing her authority to stop it immediately. Every day that she maintained her role as Willow Richardson was another day that she and other female recruits suffered harassment that violated their rights and undermined military effectiveness. The breaking point came during the third week when Thompson decided to make Willow an example during a company-wide inspection. "Richardson," Thompson announced during morning formation, "front and center. Today you're going to explain to everyone why you think you belong in my Marines." Willow marched to the front of the formation and stood at attention while Thompson circled her like a predator. "Look at her, Marines," Thompson said to the assembled recruits. 5'4", 110 pounds, couldn't fight her way out of a wet paper bag. This is what happens when politicians decide that standards don't matter and feelings are more important than fighting effectiveness. Thompson's voice carried across the formation with the authority of someone who'd spent 20 years breaking down recruits. "Richardson here thinks she can be a Marine because someone told her that girls can do anything boys can do. But when bullets start flying and Marines start dying, you want someone next to you who can carry your wounded body to safety, not someone who needs help carrying her own equipment." Rebecca stood motionless, documenting every word while maintaining the nervous demeanor expected of an intimidated recruit. "Tell us, Richardson," Thompson continued, "what makes you think you have what it takes to be a United States Marine?" "Sir, this recruit believes that dedication and training can overcome physical limitations, sir," Willow replied with the scripted response that she'd been using for 3 weeks. Thompson laughed with the cruel satisfaction of someone who'd set up an opportunity for public humiliation. "Dedication and training? Richardson, you can't do 10 proper push-ups. You can't run 3 miles without falling behind. You can't field strip your weapon without help. What exactly are you dedicated to, proving that women don't belong in combat roles?" The formation of recruits watched in uncomfortable silence as Thompson continued his verbal assault. Male recruits had learned not to intervene in these gender-focused attacks, while female recruits absorbed the message that questioning authority would result in similar treatment. "I'll tell you what, Richardson," Thompson said with theatrical generosity. "I'm going to give you one chance to prove that you belong here. Tomorrow morning, you're going to complete the confidence course in the same time as the male recruits. No special accommodations, no reduced standards, just pure performance. When you fail, and you will fail, you're going to stand in front of this company and explain why women shouldn't be Marines." Rebecca realized that Thompson was escalating his harassment to a point that could no longer be tolerated. The confidence course was a series of physical obstacles designed to challenge experienced Marines, not recruits in their third week of training. Setting impossible standards and using failure to justify discrimination was a clear violation of training protocols. More importantly, Thompson's behavior was being observed and adopted by other drill sergeants and recruits throughout the depot. His systematic harassment was creating a culture that would affect female Marines long after this particular training cycle ended. That evening, Rebecca made the decision to contact her commanding officer through encrypted communication channels that had been established for emergency situations. "Colonel Stone reporting," she said into the secure communications device hidden in her personal effects. "Request immediate intervention. Training violations have escalated beyond documentation phase." The response came 12 hours later in the form of an unannounced inspection by General Marcus Hayes, the commanding general of Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island. General Hayes had been briefed on Colonel Stone's undercover mission and was prepared to witness training violations, but he wasn't prepared for what he observed during his surprise inspection. Hayes arrived at 0600 hours while the recruit company was preparing for morning formation. He'd chosen to conduct an unannounced inspection specifically to observe normal training conditions without giving drill sergeants time to modify their behavior for official visits. What he witnessed was a systematic pattern of gender-based harassment that violated every principle of military leadership and Marine Corps values. Thompson was in the middle of his promised humiliation of Willow Richardson, having assembled the entire company to watch her attempt the confidence course under conditions designed to ensure failure. "Watch carefully, Marines," Thompson announced as Willow approached the first obstacle. "This is what happens when we lower our standards to accommodate political correctness." Hayes observed from a distance as Thompson set up Willow for failure by requiring her to complete obstacles in sequence and time limits that weren't used for standard recruit training. The exercise wasn't designed to evaluate or improve performance. It was designed to create a public failure that would reinforce gender stereotypes. But what Hayes witnessed next would change everything about the investigation. Instead of failing as Thompson expected, Willow completed the confidence course with efficiency and technique that exceeded most recruits in their final week of training. Her performance demonstrated advanced military conditioning, tactical movement skills, and obstacle navigation expertise that should have been impossible for someone 3 weeks into basic training. Thompson stared in disbelief as Willow completed the final obstacle and reported her time, a performance that would have been impressive for a seasoned Marine, let alone a struggling recruit. That's impossible," Thompson muttered, watching Willow stand at attention without even appearing winded. Hayes approached the formation with the bearing of someone who'd spent 30 years in military command and had just witnessed something that required immediate investigation. "Drill Sergeant Thompson," Hayes announced with the authority that made experienced Marines stand straighter. "Explain to me how a recruit you've described as physically inadequate just completed the confidence course faster than most Marines in advanced training." Thompson struggled to process what he'd witnessed. "Sir, there must be some mistake. Richardson has been failing basic physical requirements for 3 weeks." Hayes walked directly to where Willow stood at attention and studied her face with the recognition of someone who'd reviewed personnel files for every significant officer in the Marine Corps. "Recruit Richardson," Hayes said with careful formality, "state your full name for the record." "Sir, Willow Richardson, sir," she replied, maintaining her cover identity. Hayes pulled out a folder marked with security classifications that indicated access to sensitive personnel information. "Recruit Richardson, according to this file, your real name is Colonel Rebecca Stone, and you've been conducting an undercover investigation into training violations at this depot." The silence that followed lasted exactly 15 seconds and changed everything about the power dynamic that had existed for 3 weeks. Thompson's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally absolute horror, as he realized that he'd been systematically harassing a field-grade officer who outranked everyone at the depot except the commanding general. "Colonel Stone," Hayes continued with the respect due to a senior officer, "permission to break cover and resume your normal duties." Rebecca straightened into the military bearing that she'd been hiding for 3 weeks, and the transformation was immediate and dramatic. The uncertain recruit posture disappeared, replaced by the confident presence of someone who'd commanded Marines in combat operations. "Sir, Colonel Stone reporting completion of undercover investigation into training violations," she said with the crisp professionalism that Thompson had never heard from the recruit he'd been calling Toothpick. The assembled recruits stared in stunned silence as they realized that the woman they'd watched being humiliated for 3 weeks actually outranked every person they'd met during their military training. Thompson was the first to understand the implications of what had just been revealed. "Ma'am, we didn't know." "Drill Sergeant Thompson," Rebecca said with the tone of an officer addressing a subordinate who'd committed serious violations, "you didn't know, because you never bothered to look beyond your assumptions about women in military service." Hayes addressed the formation with the gravity of someone delivering news that would reshape their understanding of military culture. "Marines, You've just witnessed the conclusion of a classified investigation into training methods at this depot. Colonel Stone has spent 3 weeks documenting violations of military regulations and Marine Corps values. Rebecca stepped forward to address the recruits who'd watched her endure systematic harassment while believing she was just another struggling recruit. For 3 weeks, she said with the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak about military service, I've documented training methods that violate regulations prohibiting discrimination based on gender. I've observed harassment designed to break down rather than build up Marines, and I've watched how these violations affect both female recruits and the male recruits who learn to accept discrimination as normal military culture. She paused to look directly at Thompson, Martinez, and Rodriguez, who were standing at attention with the rigid posture of subordinates facing disciplinary action. But most importantly, Rebecca continued, I've gathered evidence that will ensure these violations are corrected and that future Marines receive training that builds character rather than reinforcing prejudice. Hayes announced the immediate suspension of the 3 drill sergeants pending formal investigation and disciplinary action. Rebecca's documentation would support courts-martial that would remove them from positions where they could continue harming recruits and undermining military effectiveness. The investigation's findings led to policy changes throughout Marine Corps training that established clear standards for appropriate military instruction and created oversight mechanisms to prevent future violations. Rebecca's 3 weeks of endured abuse had protected countless future recruits from similar treatment. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the recruits who'd witnessed the revelation. They learned that strength sometimes means enduring abuse temporarily to protect others permanently, that assumptions about people's capabilities can be dangerously wrong, and that real leadership means sacrificing personal comfort to ensure that everyone receives fair treatment. Thompson, Johnson, and Williams were court-martialed and dismissed from military service. Their systematic harassment of female recruits was found to violate multiple regulations and to constitute conduct unbecoming of Marines. Rebecca returned to her normal duties with a commendation for her undercover work and a promotion to the Pentagon staff, where she developed training programs that prevented the kind of abuse she'd documented. The recruits completed their training under new drill sergeants who understood that building Marines meant challenging everyone to excel rather than targeting anyone for harassment based on gender, race, or any other characteristic unrelated to military performance. Years later, when those recruits became Marines serving in combat operations, they carried with them the lesson that the person being underestimated might actually be the most qualified person in the room, and that real strength sometimes means enduring injustice temporarily to ensure justice permanently. Willow Richardson had been a carefully constructed identity designed to reveal the worst aspects of military culture. Colonel Rebecca Stone was the real person who'd sacrificed 3 weeks of dignity to protect the future of Marine Corps training and ensure that her service would create better Marines rather than perpetuate discrimination. Sometimes the person being humiliated is gathering evidence that will change everything. And sometimes the strongest response to abuse is patient documentation that leads to comprehensive justice rather than immediate retaliation that only addresses surface problems. Have you ever watched someone endure unfair treatment while knowing they had the power to stop it immediately? Sometimes the most powerful people are those who choose to suffer temporarily in order to create permanent solutions that protect others from the same injustice. 6 months after the Paris Island investigation concluded, Colonel Rebecca Stone was promoted to Brigadier General and assigned to head the newly created Marine Corps Office of Equal Training Standards. Her first initiative was implementing the Invisible Observer program, where senior officers would conduct random undercover assessments of training facilities worldwide. The program's success exceeded all expectations. Within the first year, 12 additional drill sergeants were removed from training positions for discriminatory practices, and over 40 training procedures were revised to eliminate gender-based disparities. Most significantly, female recruit graduation rates increased by 37%, while performance evaluations showed that both male and female Marines were achieving higher standards when trained in environments free from systematic bias. General Hayes, who had witnessed Rebecca's revelation at Parris Island, became one of the strongest advocates for the new training protocols. During his promotion ceremony to Marine Corps Commandant, he specifically credited the undercover investigation with opening his eyes to institutional problems he'd been unable to see through conventional oversight methods. The most dangerous enemy of military effectiveness, Hayes declared in his acceptance speech, isn't foreign adversaries or budget constraints. It's the assumptions that prevent us from recognizing and developing the full potential of every Marine under our command. Thompson, Johnson, and Williams faced more than just dismissal from military service. Their court-martial proceedings revealed a pattern of abuse that had affected over 200 female recruits during their combined 23 years as drill instructors. Civil lawsuits filed by former recruits resulted in financial penalties that served as a deterrent to other military personnel who might consider similar conduct. More importantly, their cases became part of mandatory training curriculum for all Marine Corps instructors, demonstrating the personal and professional consequences of allowing prejudice to influence military training decisions. Private Maria Santos, whose panic attacks had been triggered by discriminatory treatment, went on to become one of the Marine Corps' most decorated female officers. After completing her initial training under reformed protocols, she served 3 combat deployments and eventually commanded a battalion in Afghanistan. Her success story became a powerful example of what could be achieved when training focused on developing capabilities rather than reinforcing limitations. Private Jennifer Chen overcame the eating disorder that had resulted from harassment about physical appearance and became a military intelligence specialist whose analytical skills contributed to successful operations in 3 different theaters. Her expertise in psychological operations proved invaluable in understanding how enemy forces use discrimination and prejudice to undermine military effectiveness. The male recruits, who had begun adopting discriminatory attitudes, underwent intensive retraining that helped them understand how bias undermined unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. James Parker became a strong advocate for gender equality in military service, while Michael Davis developed training programs that helped other Marines recognize and overcome unconscious prejudices. Rebecca's investigation had proven that systematic discrimination wasn't just morally wrong. It was strategically counterproductive, reducing military effectiveness by failing to utilize the full capabilities of qualified personnel and creating cultural divisions that weakened unit cohesion. The Marine Corps began tracking long-term outcomes for recruits trained under different protocols, and the data consistently showed that units trained without gender-based discrimination performed better in combat evaluations, had higher retention rates, and demonstrated superior teamwork under stress. International military observers studying the reforms requested similar training protocols for their own forces, recognizing that the principles Rebecca had established were applicable across different military cultures and organizational structures. 10 years after her undercover mission, Brigadier General Rebecca Stone was invited to address the NATO Military Leadership Conference about institutional bias in military training. Her presentation, titled "The Strategic Cost of Assumptions," became required reading for military academies in 17 countries. "The greatest threat to military effectiveness," she told the assembled leaders, "isn't the enemy we can see. It's the prejudices that prevent us from seeing the strength and capability of our own forces." Rebecca's 3 weeks as Willow Richardson had demonstrated that sometimes the most effective leaders are those willing to sacrifice their own comfort and dignity to gather the evidence necessary for systematic change. Her investigation had protected countless future Marines from discriminatory treatment while improving military effectiveness across the entire service. The lesson that emerged from Parris Island became fundamental to modern military leadership philosophy. Assumptions about people's limitations often reveal more about the limitations of those making the assumptions than about the actual capabilities of those being judged. 20 years after her undercover mission, Major General Rebecca Stone received the Distinguished Service Medal, the military's highest non-combat award, for her contributions to military training reform. The ceremony took place at the same Paris Island facility where she had endured 3 weeks of systematic harassment while documented evidence that would transform Marine Corps culture. During her acceptance speech, Rebecca reflected on the cost of institutional change and the courage required to challenge systems that seemed unchangeable. "The hardest part of my undercover mission," she told the assembled military leaders, "wasn't enduring the abuse or maintaining my cover identity. It was watching other people suffer while knowing I had the power to stop it immediately, but choosing instead to gather evidence that would prevent future suffering." She paused to look at the audience, which included several female Marines who had benefited from the training reforms her investigation had initiated. Real leadership sometimes requires accepting short-term pain to create long-term solutions. It means choosing comprehensive change over immediate gratification and understanding that the most effective battles are often fought in silence until victory can be achieved completely. The Marine Corps Training Command had established the Willow Richardson Memorial Training Standards, named after Rebecca's undercover identity, which required that all training methods serve legitimate military purposes and that discrimination based on gender, race, or any other protected characteristic be treated as a serious offense requiring immediate intervention. These standards had been adopted by military services in 32 countries and had become the international model for eliminating institutional bias from military training programs. Rebecca's investigation had proven that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it means charging into battle, and sometimes it means standing still and absorbing abuse while gathering the evidence necessary to protect others from similar treatment. Her story became required study for military leadership courses worldwide, demonstrating that the most effective officers are often those who understand that temporary sacrifice can achieve permanent victory. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, you can subscribe to see more incredible stories like this one.